Picture this: a woman screaming in a Victorian asylum while two men shovel coal in the basement, powering a steam engine connected to a mechanical arm that extends through a hole in the wall. This wasn't torture. This was the prescribed medical treatment for women who showed excessive emotional expression. They called the machine the manipulator. George Taylor patented it in 1869. The patent documents are still available, though most medical historians prefer to ignore them. What started as pelvic massage evolved into something infinitely darker. See, doctors' hands got tired. 1 hour per patient, sometimes more, to achieve what they clinically termed hysterical paroxysm. So they mechanized it. Then they electrified it. By 1883, Mortimer Granville's 40-pound battery-powered device was reducing treatment time to 5 minutes. Efficient, progressive, thoroughly documented in medical journals as revolutionary healthcare. But mechanical devices were just phase 1. When Victorian physicians realized they could permanently cure hysteria through surgical intervention, the real horror began. The London asylum files contain detailed records of procedures that would be considered war crimes today. Before I show you what they did to Charlotte Perkins Gilman, you need to understand every single medical institution endorsed this. Every single one. Let me take you to that medical archive in 1898, where a researcher's gloved hand trembles as they read Dr. R. Blank, Maurice Bucky's presentation notes from the American Medico-Psychological Association meeting in St. Louis, May 10th through 13th, a conference attended by every leading psychiatrist in North America. And the words on that yellowed paper blur as the full implications become clear. Surgical removal of healthy organs to restore sanity. And this wasn't some fringe theory proposed by a medical outlier, but the accepted standard of care presented to thunderous applause, documented in the conference proceedings, that somehow survived while so many patient records mysteriously disappeared. And when that document falls from those trembling fingers, we see the header that changes everything. London Asylum for the Insane Women's Ward. Surgical interventions 1,895, 1,898. And below it, a number that stops your heart. 3,847 procedures performed. Think about that number for a moment. 3,847 women underwent surgical removal of their reproductive organs, not for cancer, not for disease, but for reading too many books, for refusing marriage proposals, for masturbation, for political opinions, for wanting to vote. And these weren't desperate procedures performed in backward rural clinics, but operations conducted in the most prestigious medical institutions across Europe and America, from the Salpêtrière in Paris to the Pennsylvania Hospital in Philadelphia, each one meticulously documented with before and after behavioral assessments that read like something from a dystopian nightmare, where terms like restored to feminine docility and cured of intellectual pretensions were stamped as successful outcomes. What would you do if you discovered your great-grandmother's medical records contained these procedures? Because, statistically, if you had female ancestors in Victorian Europe or America, at least one of them encountered this system. And what's truly terrifying isn't just that this happened, but that we're about to discover the surgeries were actually the merciful option compared to what came next. The scream echoes through Victorian London's foggy streets in 1859, past gas lamps where ladies in crinolines hurry past asylum transport carriages collecting women daily. Dr. Edward Tilt publishes his claim. 25% of all women suffer from hysteria. The symptoms? Faintness, nervousness, insomnia, fluid retention, muscle spasms, irritability, loss of appetite. And most tellingly, a tendency to cause trouble. Any woman who questioned anything could be diagnosed as hysterical. Reading novels, writing poetry, sexual desire, lack of sexual desire. The Merck Manual listed these as legitimate symptoms requiring immediate intervention. Elizabeth Garrett's 1862 diary describes her diagnosis. The doctor informed father that my desire to study medicine was itself proof of a disordered mind. When she questioned this, the doctor's response chills the blood. The very fact that you question my diagnosis proves how diseased your mind has become. An inescapable trap where denial confirmed guilt and acceptance meant surrendering to whatever treatment these men deemed necessary. The Greeks started it, the Victorians perfected it, and we're still living with the consequences. Travel back to 2000 BC, where the Kahun Papyrus, the oldest medical document we possess, describes women's illnesses as caused by the uterus spontaneously moving through the body like some parasitic creature seeking satisfaction, and the Egyptian physicians prescribed placing pleasant smells near the vagina and foul odors at the nose to lure this wandering organ back to its proper place. A theory so absurd yet so enduring that 4,000 years later Victorian doctors were still essentially practicing the same medicine with fancier tools. Hippocrates, the father of medicine whose oath doctors still swear today, declared the uterus could travel through a woman's body causing suffocation, seizures, and madness when it became dry from lack of male seed, and his treatments involved marriage and pregnancy as the only cure, establishing a medical tradition that literally prescribed rape as health care. Then came Galen in the 2nd century, who wrote, Passio hysterica, unum nomen est, varia tamen et innumera accidentia, sub se comprehendit, meaning hysteria has one name but countless symptoms, conveniently making any female behavior a potential sign of disease. And he added his own twist, the retention of female seed that became toxic without regular release through intercourse, creating a medical justification for sexual assault that would persist for 2 millennia. The word hysteria itself comes from the Greek hystera, meaning uterus, literally defining women by their reproductive organs and declaring those organs the source of all female ailments, a linguistic trap that made every woman's body a ticking time bomb of potential madness. Century after century, this ancient misogyny hardened into unquestioned medical fact, passed from physician to physician like sacred knowledge, through the medieval period where women with hysteria were burned as witches, through the Renaissance where they were locked in convents, through the Enlightenment where reason somehow never extended to questioning why half the population was considered inherently diseased, until it reached Victorian London where modern technology could finally deliver ancient prejudice with industrial efficiency. The truly horrifying part isn't that Victorian doctors believed this nonsense, but that they had 4,000 years of medical authority backing them up, every textbook, every journal, every professor repeating the same fundamental lie. Women's bodies are broken by design and require male intervention to function properly. Dr. Buck at the London asylum wasn't some radical innovator when he removed women's ovaries to cure insanity. He was following a tradition older than Christianity, older than the Roman Empire, older than written English, a tradition that said women's reproductive organs were the enemy and had to be controlled, suppressed, or removed entirely. This wasn't medicine. This was ritualized misogyny with a medical degree. And the machines they built to deliver this treatment were just the latest evolution in humanity's longest-running medical fraud. Because when the manipulator failed to cure women permanently, when even 40-pound vibrators couldn't suppress female autonomy, they turned to something more final. A steam engine roars behind a wall. On the other side, a hole. Through it emerges the manipulator. Dr. George Taylor's patent application, filed that year with the United States Patent Office, describes a movement cure apparatus consisting of a padded table approximately 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, the size of a dining table, with a strategic cutout in the center through which a vibrating sphere would make contact with the patient's body. And the technical drawings show gears, pistons, drive shafts, all the mechanical precision of the Industrial Revolution applied to female flesh. The steam engine required to power this monstrosity couldn't even fit in the same room as the patient. So it sat in the basement or behind a wall, burning coal at a rate of 50 pounds per hour, generating enough noise and vibration to shake the entire building, while 2 men, always men, fed the furnace and monitored pressure gauges, adjusting valves to control the speed and intensity of the mechanical arm's movements. Think about that image for a moment. Two men shoveling coal in a basement. Sweat dripping, muscles straining, keeping that engine running while upstairs a woman sat alone with a machine. No human touch. No eye contact. Just the relentless mechanical rhythm and the knowledge that strangers were controlling her body from another room entirely. The patent describes the treatment in purely clinical terms. Therapeutic vibration applied to affected areas to relieve congestion and restore healthy circulation. But the reality was a woman strapped to a table while a steam-powered phallus operated by invisible men pounded into her for as long as the doctor deemed necessary, sometimes hours, until she either achieved hysterical paroxysm or passed out from exhaustion. Taylor marketed the manipulator to sanitariums and large medical practices, advertising its efficiency in treating up to 20 patients daily without operator fatigue, reducing women to units of production, their orgasms to manufacturing quotas, their bodies to problems requiring industrial solutions. The price tag of $800, equivalent to $25,000 today, meant only the most prestigious institutions could afford one, turning mechanical rape into a status symbol for progressive medical facilities. Patients' accounts, when they exist at all, describe the experience in fragmented, traumatized language. The terrible noise. The shaking that wouldn't stop. Feeling my soul leave my body. But these testimonies were dismissed as further evidence of hysteria. Proof that the treatment was working. That the disease was fighting back against the cure. The Chattanooga Vibrator Company, which licensed Taylor's design, produced an advertising pamphlet in 1882 that still survives in the Library of Congress archives, featuring testimonials from satisfied physicians praising the device's unfailing ability to produce therapeutic crisis in even the most resistant cases. And by resistant cases they meant women who fought back, women who refused to submit, women whose bodies wouldn't perform on command. The technical specifications reveal the true horror: adjustable speed from 0 to 4, 0 vibrations per minute, pressure controls allowing up to 50 pounds of force, and most disturbing of all, restraint attachments listed as optional accessories for uncooperative patients. Because when industrial machinery failed to break a woman's will, they simply added chains. If steam was disturbing, electricity made it intimate. In 1883, Dr. Joseph Mortimer Granville unveiled his electromechanical vibrator, a 40-pound portable device that physicians could theoretically carry on house calls, though the wet cell battery alone weighed as much as a small child and leaked acid that burned through medical bags and occasionally through flesh. This was progress. This was the future. The vibrator became the 5th electrical appliance approved for home use, after the sewing machine, fan, tea kettle, and toaster. But before the vacuum cleaner or iron, because apparently society prioritized mechanized orgasms over clean floors or pressed clothes, though they'd never admit that's what they were prioritizing. Medical journals erupted with enthusiasm. The Lancet called it a godsend to the treating physician, while the Journal of the American Medical Association praised its remarkable efficiency in cases requiring prolonged stimulation, and nobody seemed to notice or care that they were describing sexual assault with the language of technological innovation. Granville's device came with an array of vibratodes, different attachments for different therapeutic applications, including a rectal attachment for internal massage, a breast attachment for mammary congestion, and various sizes of vaginal attachments, euphemistically called internal applicators, all packaged in a dignified mahogany case that looked more like a Victorian gentleman's grooming kit than a collection of medical sex toys. The instruction manual, preserved in the British Medical Archives, reads like pornography disguised as clinical procedure. Apply the appropriate vibratode with steady pressure to the affected region, maintaining consistent contact while gradually increasing intensity until the patient experiences the therapeutic crisis, indicated by flushing of the skin, rapid breathing, and involuntary contractions of the pelvic musculature. By 1900, American manufacturers had refined Granville's design, creating smaller, lighter models that weighed only 10 pounds and could plug into the new electrical outlets appearing in middle-class homes. transforming what had been an asylum horror into a domestic convenience, something a husband could purchase for his wife's health, something a woman could use in the privacy of her bedroom while her family ate dinner downstairs, normalizing trauma as self-care. The Sears Roebuck catalog of 1,902 offered vibrators for $5, advertising them as aids to health, beauty, and marital harmony, with illustrations of smiling women in nightgowns holding these devices to their necks and backs, though everyone knew that wasn't where they were really being applied. Medical supply companies sent traveling salesmen to demonstrate these devices to doctors' wives, hosting health parties, where women would gather in parlors to learn about the latest treatments for their female troubles, creating a multi-level marketing scheme for medicalized masturbation that nobody could acknowledge as sexual. The Hamilton Beach Company, yes, the Blender people, patented their own vibrator in 1902, marketing it as more reliable than household help, a coded reference to the fact that servant girls were often forced to manually stimulate their mistresses as part of their duties, a detail that appears in multiple domestic service manuals from the period but has been carefully scrubbed from most histories. This was the horror of normalization. It wasn't hidden anymore. It was everywhere. In department stores and mail-order catalogs, in women's magazines next to recipes for angel food cake, endorsed by physicians and purchased by husbands, until every home could become its own little asylum. They complained their hands hurt. They actually wrote this down. Dr. Samuel Howard Monell, in his 1,899 treatise on gynecological massage, devoted 3 full pages to describing the physician's fatigue resulting from manual pelvic massage, lamenting that achieving hysterical paroxysm could take upward of an hour of continuous stimulation, causing cramping in the fingers, strain in the wrist, and soreness extending up through the shoulder, as if he expected sympathy for the physical toll of sexually assaulting women for profit. Can you imagine? They were annoyed by the inconvenience. The British Medical Journal published multiple articles between 1870 and 1890 discussing techniques to reduce physician exhaustion during these treatments, recommending specific hand positions, suggesting alternating between hands, even proposing team approaches where nurses would begin the stimulation and doctors would finish, like some grotesque medical relay race where the baton was a woman's body. Dr. Russell Thatcher Troll wrote in 1882 that he sometimes treated 40 women per day for hysteria, calculating that at 15 minutes per patient minimum, that represented 10 hours of manual labor, though he noted with frustration that difficult cases could require 2 hours or more of continuous massage to achieve the desired result, cutting deeply into his daily patient quota and therefore his income. The economics were undeniable. At $5 per treatment in 1880, roughly $150 in today's money, a physician treating 20 hysteria patients daily could earn the equivalent of $3,000 per day, but only if he could speed up the process, mechanize it, make it efficient, which is exactly why doctors became the earliest adopters and most enthusiastic promoters of vibrating devices. Medical conferences featured entire sessions on therapeutic efficiency in hysteria treatment, where physicians presented papers with titles like Maximizing Patient Throughput in Hysteria Management and Economic Considerations in Mechanical versus Manual Therapy, discussing women's bodies with the same language used for factory production. Never once mentioning the word consent, because consent wasn't part of the medical vocabulary when it came to female patients. The Transactions of the American Gynecological Society from 1895 contains a roundtable discussion where 12 prominent physicians debate the merits of various mechanical devices, comparing vibration rates, discussing optimal pressure levels, sharing tips for dealing with resistant patients. And not once in 47 pages does anyone ask whether women want this treatment, whether they agree to it, whether they have any say whatsoever in what's being done to their bodies. Dr. John Harvey Kellogg, yes, the cereal inventor, wrote extensively about his use of vibrating chairs, platforms, and belts at his Battle Creek Sanitarium, bragging that his mechanical devices could treat 200 women per day with minimal staff involvement, turning medical sexual assault into an assembly line operation where efficiency was the only metric that mattered. The most chilling document I've found is a letter from Dr. Augustus Gardner to his colleague in 1878, where he writes, "The tedium of these treatments nearly drove me from gynecological practice entirely, until I discovered that chloroform renders the patient compliant and significantly reduces treatment time," essentially admitting he was drugging women unconscious to make it easier to assault them. And this letter was published in a medical journal as helpful advice for other practitioners facing similar challenges in their practice. London Asylum surgical records discovered 2008. Hidden for over a century in a basement storage room behind a false wall. These documents contain Dr. R. Maurice Bucky's complete gynecological experiment logs from 1895 to 1898, meticulously detailed accounts of 847 procedures performed on women whose only crime was refusing to conform. Patient 2, 341. Mary S., aged 23, admitted for excessive reading and rejection of suitor, underwent bilateral oophorectomy, the complete removal of both ovaries, on March 15, 1896, with Dr. Buck noting patient's intellectual pretensions ceased immediately following procedure. Though he fails to mention she also ceased menstruating, aged rapidly, developed severe osteoporosis, and died at 31 from complications he never bothered to document. The progression was always the same. First came the mechanical treatments, the manipulator, or its variants, sessions lasting hours, days, weeks, and when women didn't break, didn't become the docile creatures Victorian society demanded. Dr. Bucca would write in their files, "Resistant to conservative treatment. Surgical intervention indicated. A death sentence disguised as medical recommendation. Patient 1, 788. Elizabeth R., aged 19, admitted by her father for unnatural interest in mathematics. She endured 6 months of mechanical therapy before Bucca removed her uterus entirely, writing in his surgical notes that the organ showed no signs of disease, but its removal was necessary to restore mental equilibrium. That's 6 months, and Elizabeth survived the surgery only to hang herself 3 months later using bedsheets she'd hidden for weeks. The files reveal Bucky performed an average of 4 surgeries per week, scheduling them like a production line. Mondays for ovaryectomies, Wednesdays for hysterectomies, Fridays for clitoridectomies. Yes, they routinely removed women's clitorises to cure excessive sexual excitement, which could mean anything from masturbation to simply refusing arranged marriage. Each case file includes before and after photographs. Women entering the asylum with fire in their eyes, leaving with vacant stares, their bodies violated, their organs removed, their spirits crushed so thoroughly that Buck could stamp "cured" across their files in red ink. The mortality rates are conspicuously absent from these records, but cross-referencing with cemetery records reveals the truth. 47% of surgical patients died within 5 years, either from immediate complications, infection, suicide, or what death certificates vaguely called female troubles. A euphemism for medical murder. Patient 3. 1. Sarah M., aged 34. A suffragette who'd been arrested for distributing pamphlets about women's voting rights, underwent what Bucca called therapeutic sterilization, removing her ovaries, uterus, and fallopian tubes in a single 4-hour operation without proper anesthesia, because he believed the pain itself has curative properties for the hysterical mind. And Sarah's screams were so intense that nurses in other wards reported patients begging to be discharged rather than risk similar treatment. The most damning document is Bucca's presentation to the American Medico-Psychological Association, where he proudly reported a 92% cure rate, defining cure as cessation of troublesome behaviors, never mentioning that most of these women were so traumatized, so physically and psychologically broken, that they could barely function, let alone cause trouble. These weren't medical procedures. They were systematic attempts to surgically remove female autonomy, to literally cut out the parts of women that made them human. And Buck was celebrated for it. Published in journals, invited to conferences, hailed as a pioneer in women's mental health treatment, while his victims disappeared into statistics, their names redacted, their stories buried, their bodies destroyed in the name of progress. For those who escaped surgery, there was something arguably worse. Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell's rest cure stripped away everything that made a person human. No reading, no writing, no conversation, no movement, just endless days lying in bed staring at blank walls while your mind cannibalized itself searching for any stimulation at all. Charlotte Perkins Gilman entered Mitchell's care in 1887, suffering from what we'd now recognize as postpartum depression, but Mitchell diagnosed her with neurasthenia caused by excessive mental activity unsuitable for the female constitution and prescribed complete intellectual abstinence, like thought itself was a disease requiring quarantine. The treatment protocol, preserved in Mitchell's own clinical notes, reads like instructions for psychological torture. Patient must remain in bed 23 hours daily, may sit up for 1 hour, but cannot read or write, must eat without using hands, being fed by a nurse like an infant, cannot receive visitors except physician and approved staff, windows must remain covered to prevent outside stimulation, walls must be bare of decoration, and most crucially, patient must not be permitted any creative or intellectual activity whatsoever. Gilman later wrote that after 3 months of this treatment she was so near the borderline of mental ruin that I could see over. And when she begged Mitchell to let her write just a few words daily, he responded that her desire to write was precisely the symptom that needed curing, that her mind needed to be broken of its unnatural habits, like training a wild animal. The isolation was total. Women lay in darkened rooms for months, forbidden to speak except to answer direct medical questions, their muscles atrophying, their minds fragmenting, experiencing hallucinations that Mitchell documented as therapeutic crisis necessary for recovery, never recognizing he was literally driving women insane with medical precision. Patient after patient developed what Mitchell called rest-cure psychosis, seeing patterns in the wallpaper, hearing voices in the walls, feeling invisible hands touching them, symptoms Mitchell interpreted as the hysteria fighting against treatment rather than minds breaking under enforced nothingness. One woman, identified only as Mrs. B in Mitchell's 1,891 case files, spent 6 months in complete isolation before she began eating her own hair and fingernails, the only stimulation available to her, and Mitchell's response was to put her in restraints and extend the treatment another 3 months. The economic aspect was particularly cruel. Rest Cure cost $20 per week, equivalent to $600 today, meaning only wealthy women could afford to be slowly driven mad in medical comfort, while working-class women with the same symptoms were simply locked in asylums and forgotten. Imagine being punished for thinking. Your thoughts themselves treated as symptoms. Your creativity diagnosed as disease, your intelligence viewed as pathology requiring aggressive treatment, until you learn to perform the mindless compliance that passed for female mental health. The Yellow Wallpaper, Gilman's fictionalized account of her experience, describes the wallpaper coming alive, writhing with trapped women trying to escape, a metaphor so perfect it hurts because that's exactly what these rest cure facilities were. Prisons where women watched their minds dissolve into the patterns on the walls while doctors took notes and called it healing. Mitchell treated over 1,000 women during his career, proudly noting that most emerged appropriately subdued and accepting of their feminine role, never acknowledging that he'd perfected a method for medically lobotomizing women without ever touching their brains, using boredom and isolation as surgical tools to excise the parts of their personalities that society found inconvenient. Before electricity, there was water. High-pressure water. The pelvic douche, invented in France in the 1760s and perfected in European spas by the 1860s, consisted of a metal nozzle connected to a pressurized water system that could deliver streams of water at up to 30 pounds per square inch directly onto women's genitals. Marketed as therapeutic hydrotherapy, but functioning as aquatic assault. Physicians would position women on specially designed chairs with their legs spread and secured while an operator, always male, directed the water jet with mechanical precision, adjusting pressure and temperature according to medical protocols that read like torture manuals. Begin with lukewarm water at moderate pressure, gradually increasing temperature and force until patient shows signs of approaching crisis, indicated by involuntary muscle contractions and vocalization. The Baden-Baden Spa in Germany, considered the pinnacle of medical luxury in 1863, advertised their pelvic douche treatments with elegant brochures featuring classical imagery of water nymphs and promises of complete nervous system restoration in under 4 minutes, never mentioning that those 4 minutes involved water pressure strong enough to cause bruising, administered while women gripped iron bars to keep from being knocked off the treatment chair. Dr. Edwin Lee, visiting these facilities in 1865, wrote enthusiastically about watching women emerge from treatment rooms with faces flushed, walking unsteadily, claiming to feel as if they had been drinking champagne, completely missing or deliberately ignoring that he was describing women traumatized into dissociation, their body's natural endorphin response to pain and violation being misinterpreted as therapeutic success. The treatment rooms themselves, preserved in medical facility photographs from the period, look like medieval dungeons prettified with marble and brass. Ceramic tiles on every surface for easy cleaning, floor drains to handle the water runoff, mixed with whatever bodily fluids the treatment produced. And those horrible chairs, gynecological examination tables modified with stirrups and restraints, positioned under elaborate pipe systems that look more like industrial equipment than medical devices. Spa towns across Europe competed to offer the most advanced hydrotherapy facilities, with Vichy, Marienbad, and Bath installing increasingly powerful pump systems, some capable of delivering water at 50 pounds per square inch, pressure that could strip paint from walls being directed at the most sensitive parts of women's anatomy, while physicians took notes on duration required to achieve therapeutic paroxysm. The patient accounts that survive are fragmented and coded in Victorian euphemism, but reading between the lines reveals the truth. "The water was so forceful, I feared it would tear me apart," writes one anonymous patient in 1867. "But Dr. Hoffman assured me this violence was necessary to restore my feminine nature, that my resistance was itself a symptom requiring aggressive treatment." Working-class women who couldn't afford the spa treatments received charity hydrotherapy at public hospitals, where they were subjected to ice-cold water treatments administered with fire hoses, supposedly to shock their nervous systems back to health, but actually serving as punishment for poverty, for sexuality, for existing while female and poor. The Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris, where Charcot conducted his famous hysteria demonstrations, had a hydrotherapy wing where up to 200 women daily were subjected to what they called disciplinary douching, using water pressure as a weapon to enforce compliance, to break resistance, to transform rebellion into exhausted submission that passed for sanity in a world where female autonomy was the disease and male control was the only cure. Everything you've heard about Victorian vibrators? It's worse. And also, not what you think. Rachel Main's 1999 book, The Technology of Orgasm, gave us a story we desperately wanted to believe. That Victorian doctors were so sexually ignorant, they didn't realize they were giving women orgasms, that they innocently massaged patients to hysterical paroxysm without understanding what they were doing. A narrative so perfectly absurd, it became accepted history. Spawning plays, films, countless articles, all repeating the same comforting lie that lets us laugh at the past instead of reckon with it. Then in 2018, historians Hallie Lieberman and Eric Schatzberg did what nobody had done in 19 years. They actually checked Main's sources, every single citation, every reference document, and found that none of them, not one single source, actually described Victorian doctors using vibrators to bring women to orgasm as medical treatment. The truth Main's obscured is infinitely darker because Victorian physicians knew exactly what female orgasms were, discussed them extensively in medical literature using terms like sexual spasm and venereal crisis. And when they did perform genital massage, which was rare, they knew it was sexual. They just didn't care about consent. We wanted to believe the silly story because the truth is unbearable. These doctors weren't bumbling idiots accidentally stimulating women. They were educated men who understood female anatomy perfectly well and chose to violate it anyway, not through ignorance, but through calculated medical abuse justified by 2,000 years of calling women's bodies diseased. The real documented treatments that Lieberman and Schatzberg uncovered in their research paint a different picture entirely. Vibrators were used on intestines, kidneys, lungs, skin, everywhere except genitals in most medical literature. And when genital massage was performed, it was brutal, painful, deliberately traumatic, designed not to create pleasure, but to exhaust women into compliance through what one doctor called therapeutic overwhelm of the nervous system. Maine's myth spread so successfully because it transformed a story, systematic medical sexual assault, into a comedy of Victorian prudishness, allowing us to giggle at the idea of doctors innocently masturbating women, instead of confronting the reality that the medical establishment knowingly tortured women for the crime of existing outside prescribed social roles. The actual Victorian medical journals, when you read them without Maine's selective editing, reveal physicians discussing how to break women's resistance, how to use mechanical devices to overcome feminine obstinacy, how to apply treatments despite protestation, because the hysteria itself would cause women to resist their own cure, Dr. Russell Troll wrote in 1869, not about creating pleasure, but about exhausting the morbid nervous energy through mechanical stimulation until the patient achieves a state of therapeutic collapse, essentially using vibrators as instruments of torture designed to overwhelm women's nervous systems until they shut down entirely. The patent documents for early vibrators include features Maine's conveniently ignored: restraint attachments, gag mechanisms to muffle screaming, pressure settings that could cause internal damage, and instruction manuals warning operators to ignore patient distress, as this indicates therapeutic efficacy. This isn't a story of medical ignorance but medical sadism, not prudish doctors accidentally discovering the female orgasm but educated physicians weaponizing women's own bodies against them, using mechanical devices to deliver precise, measured, documented trauma while calling it treatment, publishing their results in journals, winning awards for their innovations in breaking female resistance, all while their patients' actual experiences were dismissed, destroyed, or rewritten to fit the narrative that women's suffering was really healing in disguise. Retry the 1902 Sears Roebuck Catalog, page 438, between the sewing machines and the butter churns. Swedish movement vibrator, 5.95, brings the pleasures of youth throbbing through your body, restoring vital forces and vigorous health to weak and suffering women. Next page, the Chattanooga vibrator delivers glad tidings to female invalids, penetrating deep into affected tissues with thrilling, invigorating action that restores natural feminine vitality. These weren't hidden in medical journals. They were in the same catalogs that sold children's toys and Sunday dishes. The Hamilton Beach catalog from 1902 shows their Model 2 vibrator displayed on a lace doily, advertised as more reliable than household help, priced at $8, payment plans available. Every woman deserves the restoration only electricity can provide. Turn the page. Egg beaters, coffee grinders, and personal massagers for the modern wife seeking to fulfill her marital duties with renewed vigor. Woman's Home Companion, March 1908. Full-page advertisement featuring an illustration of a glowing ethereal woman. Why suffer from female troubles when vibratory treatment brings swift relief? Dr. Jatter's ETI, Kellogg's vibrating chair, now available for home use, delivers 1,000 to 6,000 vibrations per minute directly to affected regions, restoring natural harmony to the feminine constitution. The coded language was everywhere. Thrilling, penetrating, deeply satisfying, releases tension, promotes marital harmony, ensures wifely contentment. Modern Priscilla magazine, 1915, ran advertisements for the White Cross electric vibrator with testimonials. Mrs. J.H. from Boston writes, "Since purchasing your device, my nervous exhaustion has completely disappeared, and my husband remarks frequently on my improved disposition." The American Vibrator Company's 1913 catalog, discovered in the Kinsey Institute archives, lists 27 different models with names like the Gentleman's Helper, the Bride's Companion, and the Widow's Friend, each with increasingly elaborate attachments described in mechanical detail, but never mentioning where exactly these attachments were meant to be applied. Needlecraft magazine, targeting middle-class housewives, regularly featured vibrator advertisements between knitting patterns and recipes. Why visit expensive specialists when healing vibrations can be discreetly delivered in your own boudoir? By 1917, there were more vibrator advertisements in women's magazines than advertisements for any other electrical appliance, normalized to the point where the Montgomery Ward catalog offered a family vibrator set with multiple attachments, suitable for every member of the household, though the smallest attachment was specifically noted as for feminine complaints only. Then came 1920, the year everything changed. Stag films began showing vibrators in explicitly sexual contexts, and suddenly the advertisements vanished overnight, completely disappeared from respectable publications as if they'd never existed, because once men saw what women were actually doing with these devices, the medical pretense evaporated, and vibrators went underground for the next 40 years. The speed of this reversal tells you everything. 1 year vibrators were medical devices advertised next to toasters. The next year they were contraband, illegal to sell in many states, because the only thing more threatening than female sexuality was female sexuality that didn't require male participation. The Sears catalog that had sold vibrators for 2 decades suddenly claimed they'd never carried such products, destroying their back catalogs, pretending that entire section of their business had never existed, because admitting they'd been selling sexual devices to housewives would have destroyed their reputation as a family company. These advertisements weren't just selling products, they were documenting the massive scale of medicalized sexual assault, proving that millions of women were subjected to these devices, that it was so normalized it could be marketed between coffee grinders and carpet sweepers, that an entire society conspired to pretend that mechanized violation was healthcare until the moment the pretense became impossible to maintain. We have names, we have faces, we have their letters. Mary Thompson, aged 16, committed to Pennsylvania Hospital in 1871 by her father because she wanted to attend university, died 3 weeks after a hysterectomy performed to cure her intellectual ambitions. Her last letter to her sister reading, "They say removing my womb will make me happy to marry Thomas, but I would rather die than surrender my mind." And she did die. From sepsis, alone, her death certificate listing cause as surgical correction of hysteria. Elizabeth Garrett, the one who wanted to study medicine, was lucky because her father had money, but her housemaid Sarah wasn't so fortunate. Committed to Bethlehem Asylum in 1863 for sexual precocity, after refusing the advances of Elizabeth's brother, subjected to ice water treatments and mechanical therapy until she drowned herself in the asylum's laundry tub, rather than endure another session with the manipulator. The intersection of class and race made everything worse. Irish immigrant Margaret O'Brien, working in a Boston textile factory, diagnosed with hysteria after organizing her fellow workers to demand shorter hours, forcibly treated with a vibrator in front of her coworkers as a warning. The factory owner paying the doctor to perform public therapeutic sessions to demonstrate what happened to troublesome women. Anna Washington, a free black woman in Philadelphia, committed by her employer in 1878 for failure to show appropriate deference, subjected to experimental treatments that white women were spared, including caustic douches that caused permanent scarring, her medical records noting she was an ideal subject for aggressive intervention due to her strong constitution and inability to secure legal representation. We have a letter from 13-year-old Charlotte, Mills to her mother in 1882. They put me on the machine again today. Mama and I screamed so loud they gagged me, but doctor says screaming means the treatment is working, and I should be cured soon. But Mama, I don't know what I'm being cured of except wanting to read books, and is reading really such a sin that God requires this punishment? Charlotte's mother, who had committed her daughter on the advice of their family physician, killed herself 6 months after Charlotte died from a botched ovariectomy, unable to live with what she'd allowed to happen. The Magdalen laundries in Ireland combined religious torture with medical treatment, forcing fallen women to undergo mechanical therapy as penance for sexual sins, real or imagined, with Sister Catherine writing in 1889 that the screams during treatment sessions serve as warning to other girls about the wages of sin, never questioning why medical treatment should cause screaming. Jewish immigrant Rebecca Goldman, age 22, committed to New York's Blackwell's Island Asylum in 1895 for speaking at socialist meetings, force-fed during a hunger strike, then subjected to violent hydrotherapy that ruptured her internal organs, dying while her husband tried desperately to secure her release. The court's ruling he had no legal standing since a hysterical woman cannot be released to someone who might enable her delusions. Native American women faced something even worse: forced sterilization disguised as hysteria treatment. Entire generations eliminated under the guise of mental health care, their children stolen while they were institutionalized, their bodies used for experimental procedures no white woman would endure, their deaths not even recorded as deaths but as successful completion of treatment protocol. She was someone's daughter. She had a name. Each certificate, each asylum record, each letter represents a woman who laughed, who loved, who dreamed, who was destroyed by a medical system that saw her humanity as a disease requiring cure, and the cure was always worse than whatever they imagined the disease to be. You think this ended in 1950? Think again. Hysteria simply changed its name to conversion disorder in 1980. The same diagnosis, the same dismissal of women's symptoms as psychological rather than physical, the same fundamental belief that female suffering is somehow self-inflicted, psychosomatic, all in their heads. Right now, today, women wait an average of 7 years longer than men to receive diagnoses for conditions like endometriosis, fibromyalgia, and autoimmune disorders because doctors still assume women are exaggerating, being dramatic, seeking attention, the exact same language Victorian physicians used to justify hysteria diagnoses. A 2018 study found that women in emergency rooms reporting severe pain are 40% less likely to receive pain medication than men with identical symptoms, instead receiving sedatives and psychiatric evaluations, because somehow in 150 years we haven't stopped believing that women's pain is emotional rather than physical. The modern medical term medical gaslighting describes exactly what Victorian doctors perfected. Telling women their symptoms aren't real, their pain is imaginary, their concerns are hysterical, until women start doubting their own experiences, questioning their own sanity, accepting that maybe they really are just being difficult. This isn't history. This is now. When a woman reports chronic fatigue and gets prescribed antidepressants instead of tested for underlying conditions, when she's told her debilitating period pain is just part of being a woman, when her heart attack symptoms are dismissed as anxiety, she's experiencing the direct descendant of Victorian hysteria treatment, just without the vibrators. The vocabulary changed, but the dismissal remained. Hysteria became conversion disorder. Nervous exhaustion became chronic fatigue syndrome. Female troubles became medically unexplained symptoms. But it's all the same fundamental refusal to believe women about their own bodies. Modern wellness culture sells vaginal steaming and jade eggs with the same language Victorian doctors used for vibrators, promising to restore feminine balance and release toxins, proving we're still convinced women's reproductive organs need constant intervention, management, correction. Women are still institutionalized against their will at higher rates than men, especially women of color. Particularly black women who are diagnosed with schizophrenia, at rates 3 times higher than white women presenting identical symptoms, the same racial disparities that sent Rebecca Washington to experimental hysteria treatments in 1878. Reproductive psychiatry, a modern medical specialty, focuses on how women's hormones affect their mental health. Pathologizing menstruation, pregnancy, menopause, every natural female biological process treated as a potential psychiatric crisis requiring medical management, pharmaceutical intervention, professional oversight. The restraints are chemical now instead of mechanical. SSRIs instead of rest cures, benzodiazepines instead of hydrotherapy. But the fundamental goal remains unchanged: making women more compliant, less troublesome, easier to manage. Consider this. In 2020, during the pandemic, reports of conversion disorder and functional neurological disorder skyrocketed, almost exclusively among female healthcare workers reporting physical symptoms after extreme stress. And instead of investigating potential long COVID or occupational exposures, doctors diagnosed them with the modern equivalent of hysteria, prescribed psychiatric treatment, suggested their symptoms were psychological manifestations of inability to cope with workplace demands. The same year, multiple women on social media documented being told their post-viral symptoms were anxiety-related, until male family members accompanied them to appointments, and suddenly tests were ordered, diagnoses were made, treatment was provided. Because a man's word still carries more medical weight than a woman's lived experience. The unbroken thread from Victorian hysteria to modern medical practice isn't just historical parallel, it's direct continuation. The same institutions, the same medical schools, the same fundamental belief system that says women's bodies are inherently broken and require constant professional management, preferably by male doctors who know better than women what women need. It wasn't just doctors. It was everyone. The husbands who dragged their wives to physicians because they were difficult, who paid for treatments knowing their wives were screaming behind closed doors, who collected the broken women afterwards and called them cured because silence looked like sanity to men who needed obedient wives more than human partners. Thomas Carlyle wrote in his 1874 diary about committing his wife Agnes for hysteria treatment. The expense is considerable, but Dr. Morrison assures me 6 weeks of intensive therapy will restore her cheerful disposition and eliminate her tiresome interest in suffrage, never once questioning why his wife's political opinions required medical intervention, never wondering what intensive therapy meant, never asking why Agnes returned home 20 pounds lighter with bruises on her wrists and terror in her eyes. The mothers who brought their daughters, sometimes holding them down while doctors performed initial examinations, telling themselves this was love, this was protection, this was preparing their girls for marriage, because what was the alternative in a world where unmarriageable daughters meant social ruin and economic disaster for entire families? Nurses, almost always women themselves, who prepared the restraints, who operated the machines, who ignored the screaming, who cleaned up afterwards, who wrote in medical charts that patients were uncooperative, knowing that word would justify harsher treatment, because they needed their jobs, and refusing to participate meant becoming patients themselves. Mary Patterson, head nurse at the Illinois State Hospital from 1889 to 1903, left behind detailed records of her duties, forcing women onto examination tables, operating vibrating devices while doctors took notes, administering chloroform to difficult patients, and she did this to over 3,000 women, writing in her private journal, "I tell myself their tears are symptoms, their pleas are delusions, because if I believed otherwise, I could not continue." The entire social structure was invested in this system. Judges who ruled husbands had absolute authority over wives' medical decisions, legislators who passed laws allowing forced commitment for moral insanity, police who returned escaped asylum patients without question, journalists who wrote sympathetic articles about the burden hysterical wives placed on long-suffering husbands, servants who testified against their mistresses in commitment hearings, claiming they'd witnessed unnatural behaviors like reading at night or refusing breakfast, knowing their testimony would send women to asylums, but also knowing that refusing to testify meant unemployment and destitution. The Methodist Women's Temperance Society of Boston actually fundraised to build a wing of an asylum specifically for treating feminine disorders, believing they were helping fallen women find redemption through medical intervention, never questioning why redemption required mechanical violation and surgical mutilation. Pharmacists who sold chloroform specifically marketed for managing difficult female patients, who knew exactly what it was used for, who profited from women being drugged into compliance, who kept careful records of which households purchased the most, creating a map of medical abuse hidden in pharmaceutical ledgers. Even the women who survived often became complicit, telling younger women to submit quietly because resistance only made it worse, teaching their daughters to hide their intelligence, to perform stupidity as survival strategy, passing down trauma disguised as wisdom because acknowledging what had been done to them meant acknowledging they'd been destroyed for nothing. Evil requires only ordinary people doing their jobs, following orders, maintaining systems, choosing personal comfort over others' humanity. And every prescription filled, every commitment paper signed, every scream ignored was another thread in the web that trapped millions of women in medicalized torture chambers, decorated to look like hospitals, asylums, and respectable doctors' offices. Return to the archive. The documents are being digitized, preserved, revealed. Each page scanned contains another woman's story, another name rescued from deliberate erasure, another piece of evidence that this happened, that it was real, that it was systematic and supported and celebrated as medical progress, while women's bodies piled up in asylum cemeteries and their voices were literally cut out of history. We choose what to remember and what to forget. And for over a century we chose to forget this, to bury it under euphemisms and academic jargon, to let Rachel Maines convince us it was all a silly misunderstanding about Victorian prudishness, rather than face the truth that the medical establishment systematically tortured half the population for the crime of being female, insufficiently compliant. The danger of sanitized history isn't just that we lose the truth, but that we lose the warning. Because every generation thinks it's more enlightened than the last, thinks it would never participate in such obvious evil, while simultaneously dismissing women's pain, pathologizing women's anger, medicating women's resistance with whatever tools the current technology provides. Power and control, dressed up as healthcare. That's the constant thread from ancient Egypt's wandering wombs, to Victorian vibrators, to today's overprescription of psychiatric medications, to women who dare report that something in their bodies isn't right, that they're suffering, that they need help, not dismissal, treatment, not gaslighting, belief, not the modern equivalent of being strapped to a table while men decide what's best. The medical establishment hasn't fundamentally changed, it's just gotten better at hiding the violence behind insurance codes and pharmaceutical names, better at making women internalize the blame for their own suffering, better at convincing us that questioning medical authority makes us difficult patients rather than human beings demanding basic dignity. Right now, somewhere, a woman is being told her symptoms are anxiety when she has an autoimmune disease. Another is being prescribed antidepressants for endometriosis, pain. Another is being committed for postpartum psychosis that's actually thyroiditis. And they're all experiencing the same fundamental betrayal those Victorian women faced, a medical system that would rather silence women than heal them. The documents in this archive aren't just historical artifacts, they're evidence of an ongoing crime, proof that medical misogyny didn't end with the Victorian era but evolved, adapted, learned to hide behind progressive language while maintaining the same essential function. Controlling women's bodies, pathologizing women's resistance, breaking women's spirits while calling it treatment. We digitize these records not as curiosities but as warnings, as testimony, as the voices of millions of women reaching across time to tell us that it happened to them and it's still happening to us, just with different machines, different diagnoses, different justifications for the same fundamental violation. Listening to women's voices, really listening, not interpreting or dismissing or pathologizing but actually believing women about their own experiences. That's the radical act that could have prevented all of this and could still prevent whatever technological horror we're currently normalizing in the name of women's health. Every woman reading these archives sees herself in these stories, recognizes the dismissal, the gaslighting, the moment when a doctor's disbelief became more real than her own pain, when she started doubting her own body because medical authority said her suffering was imaginary, hysterical, all in her head. The next time someone says hysteria, remember, it was never about healing. It was always about control. The question is, what are we going to do about it now?